This time we ask, Chinese motorcycles, just how bad are they? Or do they actually represent good value for money? Here's a question for you. Have you ever owned or considered owning a Chinese motorcycle? Because that may be a more complicated question than you think. For example, many of what we think of as Japanese motorcycles are actually assembled in China. So irrespective of all the political business around motorcycles, what we're going to focus on today is what are motorcycles from China really like? Are they rubbish or are they pretty good? Oh, here we have one. Look at yours. So let's take a look at this one. So it's got everything you expect from a motorcycle. It's got, well, two wheels. It's got a disc brake at the front. 4-stroke engine with an old-fashioned carburetor. So people who love fuel injection beware. It's got an exhaust, a chain, and some lights. What more could you possibly want from a motorcycle? So this particular one is an electric and a kickstart. And build quality is not quite as bad as we expected, to be honest. Obviously in the early days, Chinese bikes had a terrible reputation, with tales of rust appearing before your very eyes. Build quality in this bike isn't too bad at all, save the mild steel exhaust with black paint on it, which is often something you find on Japanese bikes too. The engine is Yamaha based, and I don't know whether it's a copy of a Yamaha or whether it's simply made in the same factory. Quite often the Japanese companies source their engines from China these days. It's certainly based on the YBR and is pretty much identical, delivers pretty much identical performance too. Will certainly hit around 65 quite comfortably, and is very flexible, surprisingly flexible actually. So we've got a nice gear position indicator, which I think once you've been riding for a while is of no use at all really. I don't really like them. I think people tend to look down and check what gear they're in rather than just changing gear if the thing's lugging. And I don't think a gear indicator is necessarily that helpful on a motorcycle. This one's got a speedo which is in kilometres and miles. Not necessarily the easiest to read, but it's clear enough. We've got a rev counter and we've got a fuel gauge. The number of expensive bikes that we own that don't have a fuel gauge on them, and yet this dirt cheap Chinese thing does, and it seems to work absolutely fine. Well, that's enough waffle. Let's take this thing out on the road and see if it actually works like a decent bike. Now I've sent Deb out on the bike today to get her particular thoughts about it, because the general proportions of this bike make it ideal for smaller riders. So let's see how she gets on. Now this particular bike is badged as a Honley, and this really shows one of the main problems that we're having with the Chinese industry at the moment. Because quite often when these bikes arrive in Europe, they're getting badged by whichever company is importing them, rather than the badge of the company that actually produces them. This means you don't really know who's making the bike and you don't have any understanding of that company's history. So it's very difficult for many of these companies to build up any sort of brand loyalty in the way that the Japanese managed to do. And to be fair to them, it's not completely different to what some of the Japanese companies did in the 60s when they first arrived. Remember, Hondas were first imported as Bentleys to give them a more European sounding name, for example. This particular machine could be best described as a Chinese copy of a Yamaha YBR 125, and indeed the parts are said to be interchangeable. Compare it to the YBR Custom and you'll find the same single overhead cam 124cc engine with a bore and stroke of 54 by 54. It produces the same 10 horsepower at 7,800 rpm and has a 5-speed gearbox. And suspension units and brakes are again all very similar. Even the switches and dials, although not quite the same, have pretty much the same functionality. And in fact the bike even has a very similar luggage rack. And it even exhibits the same road manners. And the ergonomics, again pretty much the same. And to be honest, the only real deficiencies that we found relative to the YBR is things like the side panels were made of a thicker, slightly more brittle appearing plastic. The plastic felt just a little bit last generation. To be fair to it though, it is quite thick and solid, so I'm sure it's going to stay the course pretty well actually. Okay, so thrilling it ain't. But for a 125, is that necessarily a bad thing? And to me, there's no doubt the Chinese companies have made great strides in recent years. Build quality is up. And more importantly, the companies are using their own names rather than relying on the names applied to them by importers these days. And I think that is a major step forward if they're going to be taken seriously in the market in the future. My overall impression of the test run was that the bike felt surprisingly sophisticated and quite well put together. The riding handling were perfectly acceptable, and while the gearbox was perhaps a little vague in the lower gears, the engine generally was user-friendly, nice and flexible, and produced minimal levels of vibration. And the bike we're testing today is also a few years old, so I would assume it's been used in all weathers. Let's face it, that's what this sort of bike is for, and it seems to be holding up pretty well. There are some areas of rust, but there's nothing major to report at all really. And it certainly isn't dissolving in front of our very eyes. So who or what is a Honley motorcycle, you might ask? Well, the brand name first appeared in 2012 and was the name applied to a small number of machines imported by Earnshaw's Two Wheel Centre in the north of England, with the machines themselves actually being produced by Zongshen in China. And who are Zongshen, you might well ask? Well, they were a company founded in 1992 and is said to produce around 1 million motorcycles every year. Has around 52 wholly or partly owned subsidiary companies and employs 18,000 people. And incidentally, they're in partnership currently with Harley Davidson and Piaggio in Europe. So Deb, how did you find the riding experience on this bike?
Surprisingly, I really enjoyed riding it. It corners very well. The tyres aren't the best, but I got round corners no problem whatsoever, and I was cranking over a fair way. It's smooth. I did struggle sometimes to get from first to second gear, but I think that was rushing it a bit. But I just kept it in fifth gear and it just went. I never had to change down going through towns, roundabouts. I just kept it in fifth and I just tested it to see if it would pull, and it certainly did. So I was quite surprised. Yeah, the sitting position isn't bad either. It's quite a nice, comfortable ride. You're not reaching over too far to hold the handlebars, and your legs are in quite a neutral position, which is good for riding long distance.
The seat's quite well padded too, isn't it?
It is very well padded. Yeah, and I suppose it's good for two up as well if you wanted to take a passenger.
Have you got the appropriate licence? Yeah, it certainly would. I mean, it's quite roomy, isn't it? Obviously it's not fitted with ABS. How did you find the brakes though? Not
too bad. For a 125 they were pretty good.
Sharp?
Sharp if you press too quickly. Hey, it's only a lightweight bike, so you don't need that much pressure on the back brake. Front brake I was using most of the time just to slow down behind traffic. Suspension wise, it's quite a smooth ride. Yeah, the suspension's soft, not too bouncy, not too hard. I did hit a couple of potholes, but like with any bike, it just gives you that jolt. And other than that, it was quite a good suspension for a small bike.
I felt really quite nice. It wasn't too crashy, and generally the suspension worked really well. Considering the cost of the bike, I was really pleasantly surprised. Didn't bounce me around too much at all. Not something that's knife edge. The steering and the suspension both really are quite soft, but very user friendly, and also have to say pretty comfortable. Not a bike you'd necessarily try to get your knee down on, but to travel a long way, the suspension of the ride, quite nice, wouldn't you say?
Some of those twisty corners we were going on today, could easily get my knee down.
If you fell off?
If I fell off. In the wet.
Yeah. So how would you sum up this first Chinese bike that we've encountered?
Well, for a Chinese bike, the build quality is really good. For a learner bike, I'd really consider one of these. Yeah, I'd recommend one. It's not a make that you are aware of, and I hadn't heard of one before we got this one, but it is a really good bike.
Yeah, I think all things considered, really, consider the cost of the bike. The ride quality is much better than you would expect. Build quality isn't bad at all. It's not amazing, but it's not bad.
No, but for the price.
That's the thing, I mean, you've got to consider the price, really. That's the factor. You know, these bikes are extremely cheap, and it's a very cheap way to get yourself onto the road. The only downside is probably that insuring these bikes isn't quite as cheap as you might think, and they seem to be slightly disproportionately expensive in terms of insurance. Perhaps because they get stolen a lot, because there's so many of them about. It may be as simple as that. But other than that, running costs are very low, very fuel efficient, you know, carburettor or not, very cheap to buy, and it's cheap as chips transport.
Definitely. Good all-rounder.
Good all-rounder. So what have your experiences of Chinese motorcycles been? Good, bad or indifferent? Let us know below. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in the future? Again, message down below. If you enjoyed that video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.